it is time to address the endless debate. Which exercise should you do to grow your glutes? Hip thrusts, glute bridges, or the KAS glute bridge? So obviously we need to know what the difference between these three movement patterns is first and foremost, right? So for the hip thrust, for those who don't know, the hip thrust is where you're going to start fully on the ground, where the barbell's on the ground. Make sure your shoulder blades are in place, and you're going to focus on thrusting up until your hips reach full extension. So you're going to thrust all the way up like that and come all the way back down. The glute bridge, you're going to be in a very similar position, but your starting position is going to be where the barbell is off of the ground, full hip extension at the top, and then you don't come all the way back down. You're going to kind of hover where the barbell is above the ground. Now the KAS bridge, very similar to the glute bridge, where your starting position is still going to be where you're in an elevated position, but you're not going to be as low. You're going to be a little bit higher, where you push up for a whole full hip extension and slowly come back down, where you're not going to be as low as the glute bridge. Different from the glute bridge, but really not. Now clearly you can see that these three movement patterns are very similar, yet very different, and that often leaves people very confused as to which exercise is going to be best for them. Well, before we can answer that question, there are three considerations here. So when it comes to growing the glutes, or any muscle group for that matter, we have to consider three important variables. Number one, what movement pattern is going to effectively allow us to target a given area? Number two, are we achieving mechanical tension? And number three, are we achieving progressive overload? So what movement do we need to accomplish in order to effectively target the glutes? The movement is hip extension. So when we load our hips through hip extension, that's what's going to allow us to effectively target the area. Number two, mechanical tension. This is where you are focusing on achieving involuntary slowing at the end of a set. So that's where during the eccentric portion of a movement, you're noticing that your reps are starting to slow down, and you're doing that in an involuntary manner because we are achieving the appropriate amount of fatigue that we want in order for the muscle to actually be effectively targeted. Make sure you go back and watch my previous video about mechanical tension to learn more about the topic. The third consideration is progressive overload. And this is where we are effectively loading the glutes over time. There are many ways for you to overload the given muscle group, but three ways to effectively achieve progressive overload. One, increasing your strength, so adding more weight on the bar over time. Two, doing more reps, where your rep count is going up, which is accumulating more volume. Three, improving your form and technique, so you can effectively add more tension on your glutes. So now that we know our three main considerations in order to effectively grow our glutes, let's analyze these when it comes to a given exercise. So number one, hip extension. If we look at the hip thrust, ask yourself, are we accomplishing hip extension? And during this portion of the movement where we thrust into the air, our hips are fully extended. So yes, during a hip thrust, we are accomplishing hip extension. What about mechanical tension? Well, at the end of a given set, if you are doing enough reps or you're increasing your strength enough, eventually over time, you should notice involuntary slowing, where at the end of a given set, you are approaching failure, where you can't effectively do more reps. You don't have any reps left available in the tank, which is going to allow you to achieve mechanical tension. When we are doing the glute bridge, if our starting position is where we're a little bit more elevated, but our movement pattern pushes up like that, are we achieving hip extension? Yes, absolutely we are. Okay, cool. Hip thrusts accomplish hip extension. Glute bridges accomplish hip extension. What about the KAS bridge? Well, even though the starting point is a little bit higher than the glute bridge, are we gonna be accomplishing hip extension? Yes. Okay, cool. So the three movements accomplish hip extension, which, like I said, is the movement pattern that we want in order to effectively target the glutes. So for the hip thrusts, obviously it has a greater range of motion. Therefore, it allows you to generate more power. When you have the ability to generate more power, that means you can add more weight on the bar. You have the ability to be a lot stronger with this movement pattern, which is great as we've already talked about, one way to achieve progressive overload is by adding weight on the bar. So that's amazing. Hip thrusts can be a very effective movement. However, because of the increased power one has to generate for hip thrusts, you are going to be utilizing other muscle groups as well, mostly your quads as well as your hamstrings. Those are going to be targeted as well during that movement pattern, which is going to essentially take some of that tension off of your glutes. And as we know, increasing tension over time is another way to achieve progressive overload. So you can achieve progressive overload with the hip thrusts by adding more weight on the bar, adding more tension on the glutes. Probably not going to be the best choice when it comes to that. Now, when it comes to the glute bridge, obviously it has a shorter range of motion. Because of the shorter range of motion, typically the amount that we put on the bar isn't going to be as high because we don't have the ability to generate as much power. So that first option to achieve progressive overload by adding weight on the bar, that is going to be a limiting factor that you have to consider. So achieving progressive overload by adding weight on the bar for glute bridges, probably not the best option. However, you are going to be able to effectively do more reps and increase the tension on your glutes over time. Now, when it comes to the KAS bridge, honestly, I'm really not the biggest fan of the KAS bridge. It is such a trivial difference from the glute bridge, and I honestly think it just adds more confusion to an already confused audience. So, me personally, I don't think that there's much of a difference. The only thing is, it does allow you to shorten your range of motion just that much more, ever so slightly, where maybe over time, when it comes to adding more tension on the glutes, yeah, you know what, you might be able to effectively add even more tension on the glutes in comparison to a regular glute bridge. So when it comes to the hip thrusts, the glute bridge, and even the KAS bridge, it seems like they all have all of those considerations met, where they all have the ability to achieve hip extension, they all have the ability to achieve mechanical tension, and they all have a different way for you to achieve progressive overload. So like I said, with the hip thrust, full range of motion here where you have way more power, and because of that increased power, you're going to be using your hamstrings and your quads, which does take that tension off of your glutes, but you do have the ability to add more weight on the bar, which is going to allow you to achieve that progressive overload that you're wanting. When it comes to the glute bridge and the KAS bridge, I'm lumping these two together here, my friends. Your range of motion is going to be shortened quite a bit in comparison to the hip thrusts. It comes down to you being able to focus on doing more reps, and that's going to allow you to be able to keep more tension on your glutes, allowing you to overload the glutes in time. When it comes to doing more reps, allowing you to achieve progressive overload in that regard. And I know what you're thinking here. Kristen, that still doesn't answer my question. Which exercise should I do? And the answer is this: whatever bloody one you want. It really doesn't matter here, my friends. I would not overthink it. They all are very effective in their own way. So the approach I would take is to experiment with all three if you haven't as of yet. Pick one that you enjoy the most. Me personally, I like the glute bridge. It's an easier setup, it's a little bit quicker, and I find that I'm able to constantly achieve enough progressive overload that I need to effectively grow my glutes. If you find that you like the hip thrusts more, you feel really strong and that's very empowering for you, and you're noticing that you're getting stronger and you're noticing more tissue is being added, do hip thrusts. It's totally okay. I personally think that when you find that you stall on progressive overload, it's at that point in time it may be a good idea to switch it up. So for example, we all have a ceiling, right? Where eventually you're not going to be able to add more weight on the bar when you're doing hip thrusts. You're eventually going to tap out to the point where your form might start being impacted. Maybe you're starting to increase your risk of injury, things that we want to avoid. You don't want that law of diminishing return to come into play. So it's very important to objectively analyze that for yourself. When you find that you are approaching that plateau, it's at that point in time that I would revisit one of the other options. Swap out hip thrusts and start doing glute bridges. When you find that the tension is starting to be overloaded to the point where you don't want to do any more reps, adding more weight on the bar is just not working, and you're doing like over 20 reps or 30 reps where you feel like you're not approaching that fatigue that you want, you're not achieving mechanical tension anymore, which is where at the end of the set you're approaching that proximity to failure, it's at that point in time that, hey, it's time to switch it up. Maybe put the glute bridges away for a few training blocks and revisit your hip thrusts again. It's okay to go back and forth, but you do not need to do all three of these movements within a given training block in order to grow your glutes. Honestly, pick one. Pick one, focus on the one that you enjoy the most, that you're able to progress with the most, and focus on getting better at that movement pattern. That's the biggest thing when it comes to training. Less is more. It's about quality reps, quality sets, quality technique over how much volume you are doing. And doing 5 to 6 different hip thrust variations and glute bridge variations where you're doing B stance, one leg glute bridge, one leg hip thrust, B stand, KAS glute bridge, it's just overboard. And it comes back to you focusing on mastering a given movement pattern, prioritizing, mastering the fundamentals of it, and making sure that you are achieving those 3 considerations, focusing on full hip extension, focusing on mechanical tension, so bringing your sets close to failure, and then focusing on progressive overload. So comment down below if this was helpful as well too. Comment down below which of these movements is your personal favorite. Do you like the hip thrusts? Why do you like the hip thrusts? Do you like the glute bridge, or do you prefer the KAS glute bridge? Really open to hearing what your thoughts are on that, and feel free to let me know if you have any questions when it comes to effectively including these movement patterns into your program. Thank you all so much for checking out this video. Make sure you guys like, comment down below, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all in the next one.